Are you ready to perform at your highest potential? Thank you for joining this GP Strategies webinar, where we'll explore best practices and innovative insights to help you and your organization improve performance.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's GP Strategies webinar. My name is Kayla Ross. I'm a marketing manager for GP Strategies, and I'm very happy to be your host for today's event. If you've been before, we are very glad to have you back, and if this is your first session with us, well, a big welcome goes out to you. We have a great panel discussion planned today. I also encourage you to share the information you received today with your colleagues and networks via social media. Be sure to include the hashtag #GPWebinar or the handle @GPCorp so we're able to follow your contribution to the conversation. And finally, the slides and recording of today's event will be emailed to you within the next 48 hours. And as always, they'll be available with all of our other great presentations on our webinar recordings page at gpstrategies.com. I am so excited now to introduce you to our panelists today. I will start off here. Let me go ahead so you can see their lovely pictures. And our panelists, you can see they have their videos on if you wave hello. I'll start off with our facilitator, James Garza. With over 20 years of experience, James has worked in customer experience, training and development, employee engagement, and leadership and organizational development with a continuous focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. His passion rests in helping leaders first understand the power behind belonging, fulfillment, and purpose, and then supporting their journey in creating environments that produce those same ideas. Stace Williams is the founder and principal consultant at Interactive Dynamics. She develops leaders' excellence through facilitated learning experiences and coaching. During 30 years in this practice, she's worked with leaders at all levels in multiple industries for organizations on 5 continents, and she's known for both kindness and candor along with pragmatic optimism. Hello, Stace. Thanks for joining us. Demetrius Russell is the CEO of Venn Diagram Partners, LLC. He specializes in taking leaders and organizations on a journey of becoming more equitable and inclusive by connecting the dots between organizational goals, shared values, and high performance in the workplace and marketplace. His vision is to help individuals feel like they belong and can belong authentically. He has helped scores of leaders become self-aware on their path to modeling how to lead across differences while achieving results. Welcome, Demetrius. And Frank Lewski is an experienced consultant, facilitator, and coach in the areas of leadership, team and organizational development, with an emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion. He draws upon his 30-year corporate career as an engineer, research, and leader, working with clients from diverse functions and cultures for over 20 countries around the world. So as you can see, we have a very qualified panel today. So thank you to those of you who've joined us, and to the panelists, welcome.
Thank you, glad to be here.
All right, James, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Kayla, for the introductions. We're so grateful to have this time together today and thankful that everyone can join us for what we hope to be a really robust discussion around bias and microaggressions. Our focus for today includes looking at bias in the workplace, discussing microaggressions and how we can address them, and how we can become more personally aware of bias to eliminate it while increasing our ability to be inclusive. We'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. Before we dive into our first panel discussion, we wanted to explore the concepts of bias and microaggressions a bit more. So what really is bias? And who has it? Well, the sometimes hard truth is we all carry bias. From a formal definition standpoint, bias is a belief, typically not rooted in anything substantiated, that's based on some form of stereotypes or generalizations, or maybe even just our personal experiences. Bias directly influences our behavior and attitudes towards certain groups or individuals as well. Mazarin Bananji, a Harvard University researcher, says that most of us believe we are ethical and unbiased. We imagine we're good decision makers, able to objectively size up a job candidate or a business deal and reach a fair and rational conclusion that's in our and our organization's best interest. But more than 2 decades of research confirms that most of us fall woefully short of our inflated self-perception. And we can see so many ways in which bias can show up in the workplace. It's really easy to carry bias unconsciously. So we have to work really hard to make what is unconscious conscious. And to do that, we have to first acknowledge that we all have bias and then recognize there are different types of bias and begin to address them. And one of the best and often hardest ways to come to a more conscious place is to understand how bias can impact others. Thinking about how does bias make others feel? And that's what we see here, the impact. Microaggressions and microinequities are products of bias. And similar to bias, we can be unconscious or conscious of each. And these terms show how bias can move from just a thought or a belief to a behavior or action that can negatively impact another person or make them feel what we call othered. And otherness is the sense that what is unique about us is a liability. And just like bias, microaggressions and microinequities can exist between individuals or within systems. So the work to influence and disrupt both can be hard, but not impossible. So now we are looking at some examples of how a microaggression or microinequity can look or sound. And when experienced frequently, statements like this can create true psychological and professional damage, which can include anxiety, isolation, negative work climates, and even diminished motivation. Specific to microaggressions, recipients can spend a tremendous amount of cognitive and physical energy covering, which is the act of downplaying parts of their identity to make others feel comfortable or just for them to fit in more easily. And when we think about that, we can imagine how much more productive someone could be when they don't have to spend their energy in this way. We can think about what could someone achieve without managing the daily burden of bias and the resulting microaggressions from others. The great Maya Angelou once said, "I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better." And so when we can increase our knowledge of biases that exist in the world, both at home and in the workplace, we can then do the hard work of reflection. So do I carry bias? Yes, we all do. Okay, so then what are those biases? We're all on that same journey of discovery. And so our goal is to become self-aware and then move to inclusive behaviors that simply become habit over time, and then constantly reassess our unconscious bias. That is what our unconscious inclusion model is all about. It's not at all a linear path, but instead that constant cycle of really humble growth and awareness. But as is the case with most hard journeys, there will be obstacles. And so as we uncover our unconscious bias, we're going to face those challenges head on. And so in thinking about everything that we just covered, which are some big terms so far, let's move to our first discussion to get some deeper points of view from our panelists. And thank you to the panel for being patient while I level set some expectations and understanding around bias and microaggressions. We're going to go to Demetrius first. So Demetrius, how have you experienced personal bias, and how can we help leaders increase their personal bias awareness?
Great. Thank you, James. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to attempt to address that question as well as question number 3 by telling 2 stories that have to do with biases. So I'm combining questions 1, how have you experienced personal bias, and how can you help leaders increase their personal bias awareness, number 1. And then number 3 is, what microaggressions have you experienced directly or witnessed?
Perfect.
The first example has to do with implicit bias that James, you referred to a little earlier, and then systematic or institutional bias. And so the first story is one where I was recently consulting for a client around DE&I, and it was an audience, virtual audience of about 30 people. And when I looked at the screen, it appeared as if they were all women. So I, tried to connect with people by saying, this is going to be an interesting experience for me as the only male in the audience. And then immediately in the chat box, a person wrote back and said, I'm calling you in a good way to say that just because, we may present as one way, or in this case, what you thought would be female, I actually identify as male. And I thought, oh my gosh, right at the beginning of this workshop, I just, stepped into it. And so I apologized. We moved on, and it was a teaching moment for me. And I'm grateful for that, because now I get to tell that story to everyone of how, even those of us who do this, work every day for a living, we also make mistakes. We don't get it right all the time. And in a lot of cases, generationally, for example, I didn't grow up with, different being able to self-identify around gender. And so part of what informed my own bias was the fact that when I was coming up through corporate America and in the military, it was a don't ask, don't tell policy. And now that we're seeing, scores and scores of millennials and Gen Zers entering the workforce, being able to self-identify has become really just part of, pretty much every corporate culture that we get to see. And so I'm thankful that I had that experience. Policies are changing as a result. And I'm grateful to the millennials and the Gen Zers, because they are our, change agents. And because of that, now I oftentimes introduce myself using my pronouns, he, him, his. So that's the story about my implicit bias. The second story has to do with systematic or institutional bias. And that is, some years ago, I was working for a management consulting firm, and I was in a meeting with senior management, and it was my first meeting with this team that included the CEO. And if you've been in these types of meetings, they're like Piranha Fest. You can't really, it's hard to jump in at the right time to make your point. And so I looked at it like a double Dutch game that I played as a kid. I'm like, okay, let me time my comment perfectly so I can get in and out without fumbling over my feet. So I got in. I thought I'd made a really great comment, like Nobel laureate worthy comment, got out and felt really empowered coming back to my office. And then shortly thereafter, my manager came to me and said, hey, look, take your time. We want you to listen. And I'd already been there for several months, and I just felt othered, like I had made that person feel othered when I used my bias and thought she was a female, when in fact, she identified as a male. And so this experience of feeling othered is something that I have witnessed myself in the form of a microaggression, as well as been the perpetrator of it as well. So let me pause there. I'm happy to move to the next question, James. Why is it so difficult? But I wanted to see if you wanted me to pause here or just continue to go on.
We can take a pause there, and Frank, Stace, anything to add as far as from that leader point of view? Demetrius shared some really open and honest moments of his own journey and learning about his bias and how he experienced it himself. And thinking about that, how can we help leaders move into those moments in a really kind of open and honest way? Stace, I'll go to you.
It's a good question, and I think it's a trite saying in a way, but leading by example is huge, and that's how I've been learning about my biases from leaders like the three of you, as well as so many of the people who are on with us right now, sharing their own experience, calling me in, Demetrius. I love that. I identify as she and her as female. And I also realize that, it's super important to be respectful of others. And sometimes we don't know. So it's a process of education. It's a willingness to listen. You mentioned humility earlier, James. And one of the things I've really enjoyed about working with you and Demetrius and Frank is I think you three are role models of that. So watching other leaders and then striving to be a good example, which means owning it when we step in it, right, Demetrius? That's one of the most powerful things we can do, and being willing to have what our late mentor Terry Pierce called relevant vulnerability.
No, I love it. I like that term.
Frank, how would you supplement anything that's already been said? Hey, Frank, I think you're on mute still.
I'm going to go a slightly different direction and sort of build on what Demetrius and Stace have already said, and that is to think about the way that personal bias can also show up in a positive assumption in the topic that we're talking about here that oftentimes goes by the term of privilege. And as a 61-year-old white male, straight, not disabled individual man who's grown up in a grew up in a pretty non-diverse suburban neighborhood, I have been the quote target of a lot of positive bias, a lot of privilege. So the bias comes in that direction, and from the perspective of what ought a leader do to increase their awareness of personal bias. And I'm perhaps particularly speaking to those who have a similar profile to me, and that is to be really aware of the privilege and notice the type of treatment I might be getting and the bias that's headed my direction versus diverse colleagues and folks on my team. James mentioned the notion of the horns and halo effect of how bias can kind of go two different directions, whether the assumption is positive or negative of the individual and what group they appear to be a part of. So really paying attention to that and really acknowledging that privilege does exist, that I do have that privilege, and that, yeah, sure, the reality is, does that mean I haven't worked hard? Does that mean I haven't, I don't have some smarts, I didn't get good grades in school? No, but the full reality is, yeah, I've worked hard for where I've gotten. I, know a little bit. I've got some expertise, and I've also been the beneficiary of quite a bit of positive bias. And there are a lot of folks who also have worked hard, or maybe even harder than me, and who are smart and are likely smarter than me, who have the challenge of that personal bias. So really, as a leader, paying attention to that and knowing that I'm not giving up anything as a leader to admit that, but in fact, I might be supporting others to be, the best that they can be by acknowledging and taking some action around that.
Great. And I think it's good to see both the negative and positive impacts that bias can carry as either the recipient or the giver. Giver may not be the right word, giver of bias, but someone who exhibits bias, towards someone, it can have a positive or negative effect for sure. And I see, in the chat, lots of people are sharing their own experiences with how bias has impacted them. And good to see that sharing so we can create some more awareness across the table. Demetrius, rounding us off here to end it out, I wanted to go back to you so you could share your thoughts on that second question on how leaders can increase their personal bias awareness.
Okay, great. I know there was a question about why is it so difficult. So let me just set up that answer to the second question with the first one. So I just wanted to point out three things, some of which you've mentioned, James. One is, the biases are ingrained. We get them from the very day we're born, right, based upon upbringing and so forth. So that makes it challenging because most of us think, hey, I'm doing okay. I don't really have this issue. So it's that sort of benign ignorance around it, number one. Number two, it's also difficult because, let's face it, we're talking about race and topics that are really challenging for people and triggering for people. So I don't want to be triggered. I don't want you to be triggered. I don't want to get emotional about this, having a conversation around what happened in the news, even recently, particularly as it relates to African-American men who are unarmed and run encounters with police, right? It's triggering. So that's also what makes it difficult. And the third thing is, and this is what, and I'm playing identity politics here when I say this, is what I hear from a lot of white people when they say, I'm afraid to engage in this conversation because I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so hopefully this workshop will equip people with some tools on how to have that conversation in a quote unquote psychologically safe manner. So getting to the question, how to increase your own awareness, I'm a big fan of this quote by Albert Einstein, so I'll tee up what I'm about to say with that. And he says, I have no special talent. I am only passionately curious. And so that resonates with me pretty deeply, particularly as a Black person who has led across difference, built relationships across difference. It all started with just a curiosity of, Frank, who are you? Stace, who are you? James, who are you? And your willingness to engage in a conversation and be relatable, where you're finding commonality so that we can actually build from what we may enjoy. I just learned before we started this session that Stace happens to also, have shared the same dream as I did. I wanted to play in the NBA. Apparently, she wanted to play in the NBA as well. We build from there, right? I'm looking forward to talking to her offline about that dream. And so be curious. How can we increase your own awareness? Be curious and be relatable. And now I'll jump out of the double Dutch and let my co-panelists join in as well.
I think that's a great segue moment to what we're going to talk about next, because we've talked about that ownership piece and being an owner of our curiosity and moving forward with that, but also when we mess up and sort of step in it, as we've said a couple of times, that we are really looking at how intent versus impact aligns with each other and then taking responsibility for that. Let's actually move to that next piece. So, it's a moment we've all experienced. We maybe say or do something within the right intentions or without the intention maybe to do harm, and we still end up hurting someone or something. From a personal standpoint, it's like when my youngest son is doing 86 cartwheels in our living room, trying to be the best gymnast that he can be, after being told to stop numerous times, and he ends up knocking over a lamp and breaking it. And what's the first thing that we hear out of our children's mouths? I didn't mean to. And so we'll talk about it with him and emphasize that, his intention, of course, was not to break the lamp. We know that. He just wanted to win gold in his own living room. But the impact is the lamp is broken. And so we fall into this behavior trap as leaders as well. And instead of explaining away our intent, we should really work to understand the impact and then take responsibility for it. And sometimes the best response when we've messed up is just a simple, I'm sorry, and maybe moving into that curious moment from there, as we've stated before. Here's another way to look at intent versus impact, and we're folding in the added perspectives of equality, equity, and liberation or freedom. And when we think about equality, it isn't the idea that we're all the same necessarily. Clearly, the individuals in the equality image we see here are very different. But instead, we think about equality as they all deserve to be at the game. They all deserve a spot. As we move to equity, we recognize that our differences are there, and we recalibrate our response accordingly. And each person comes with a different set of response needs or support. And this is really a higher evolution of equality expression. However, when we move to liberation, or what we can call true freedom, we move beyond just presence, so who's there, to actual participation. And we create an experience that doesn't separate or contain barriers to overcome. And sometimes as leaders, what we intend to be or say does not always match the impact we hope to make. And this is also true for how we create experiences of equality, equity, and liberation across our teams. What we intend to be equitable sometimes is more about equality, or what we think is true access or full freedom still rests in equity. And as we work to create environments where our intent aligns with our impact, and we bring forward the concepts of equality, equity, and liberation in the right balance, we coincidentally build trust with others. People trust when they feel valued, seen, and heard. So there's a true direct correlation between our management of intent and impact and trust. And until we can build the trust, the impact will likely outweigh the intent and probably not in our favor. So let's uncover that a bit more and share some insight as to why we might feel the need to justify or maybe even excuse our behaviors. Stace, I'll go to you first. How do you think we can help others truly see themselves and their intentions without moving to that place where we're excusing and justifying our behavior?
It's such an important question, James, and I loved your breaking the lamp example. We all make mistakes, and an example I heard recently from the meditation teacher and nonviolent communication practitioner, Orem J. Sofer, really hit home. James, let's imagine you and I are in a crowded place together. Obviously, this is the before times, right, pre-COVID, and you're wearing heavy boots and I'm wearing sandals, and you accidentally step on my foot, and I say, ouch. Your instinctive immediate response is to say, oh my gosh, Stace, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? That's a mistake. Now, with microaggression and bias, what gets in the way, I think, is this belief that so many of us, I can see it in the chat, so many of us on the session today want to be seen as good people. And we've been raised to believe that good people don't commit overt acts of racism and sexism. Yet you made the case, and Demetrius, Frank, you did as well. This is human. We all have biases. There are more than 200 cognitive biases have been identified by neuroscientists. This is not just a socialization thing. This is our very evolution in our brains. And I think because we define ourselves as Dolly Took says, as good people, we don't want to be seen as engaging in bias. And so when we commit a behavior, an action that is a microaggression and are made aware of it, the reaction is not to say, I'm sorry, are you okay? It's to feel embarrassed and ashamed. And Brene Brown reminds us that it's really important to let that go. And Dolly says, stop thinking of yourself as either good or bad. Get out of that binary thinking. Recognize that you're goodish, and when called on it, use it. Frank, I know you can relate to this as a practitioner of emotional intelligence. Use the somatic awareness, that uh-oh feeling, to say, wait a minute, maybe I could learn something here. And while your immediate reaction, I know mine is to be embarrassed, lead with curiosity and care, and a bit of compassion. I saw Demetrius in the conversation. I made this comment, and in the group discussion, you didn't say anything else. And I'm wondering, was there something I said or did that caused you to shut down? Or if Demetrius comes to me and says, hey, Stace, we had that meeting last week, and you made this comment. I wanted to tell you how that impacted me. Now, my first reaction, Demetrius, no matter how much I trust you, and I do, is going to be, oh, fill in the blank here with your favorite expletive. But I am learning over time that that's a signal. And my friend and colleague Steve Farber says when you have those, oh, you know what moments, you can reframe for yourself as a leader and say, wait a minute, I'm about to learn something. And so come from that place of curiosity and ask, okay, Demetrius is going to give me this feedback. This is a learning moment. What can I learn from this? And again, I think if we're willing to do that as individual leaders, we're willing to model that with those we have the privilege to lead, and then we're also willing to encourage them to do the same thing. So when I see someone else engaging in a potential microaggression or active bias, starting with an objective observation and then asking, did I hear that correctly? Did what I see happen that way for you? And inviting that person, tell me a little bit about that. And then once the conversation is open, we built a little bit of goodwill and trust. That's the moment where I might say, you know, I think the context for me might be a little different to how it is for you, or the context for this other person might be a little different. Are you open to exploring that? Frank, Demetrius, what do you want to add? I know you both have a wealth of experience here.
Frank, you want to go ahead? I'll follow you.
All right, sure. So, Stace, as you were talking, there was a particular example that was coming to mind for me where, you know, I was the one who fell into this story of the question, the intent versus impact, where I'll try and frame it up quickly here. I was a couple years ago, I was facilitating a 2-day program. Topic was leadership communication. It was the evening in between the 2 days. The group decided to have a get-together, a social gathering, and even though I don't always join those gatherings, I happened to join this one. I was just mingling around the group and happened to overhear a subset of the participants talking politics. Now this was back again a few years ago when Barack Obama was in the White House, and they were talking about President Obama and giving some examples of how they felt he was demonstrating some of the leadership communication topics that we had discussed earlier in the day. So I just registered that and then went back to the hotel that night, and I committed one of the prime mistakes that facilitators ought to never make in delivering corporate training. I decided to bring in a political example into the program the second day. And so I quick Googled around, found on YouTube, found Barack Obama delivering a communication and said, wow, this is a really great example. It illustrates a bunch of things that we're going to talk about. So I bring in the example, I show it in the program, and I should not have been surprised, but it bombed. As you might expect from a political example, half the room thought it was great illustration of the concepts, and the other half of the room thought it was a terrible example of the concepts. So on a break after going through that, I came up to a couple of individuals who I had seen the night before in this discussion about President Obama. And individually, I just, you know, more jokingly had a conversation, say, oh, what happened there? You know, it didn't sound like what was talked about last night. Talked to a couple people. One of the individuals I came to was a young African-American woman. And I was, you know, with a smile on my face, I said something. She had been kind of quiet in the classroom on this example. And I walked up to her and I said, come on, what happened? I really expected you to chime in on this. Where were you? You didn't support me. And she just kind of gave me a and walked away. You know, had to go finish the rest of the day of the class, and it was kind of on my mind. At the end of the day, as these programs do, there was an evaluation form to be filled out. Came to read her evaluation, and she said very clearly and explicitly, facilitator is a racist. He came to me assuming that I was given I was an African American person, that I would fully support everything that Barack Obama had to say. And intent versus impact. And to Stace's point about, well, that is the last way I want to come across to anyone. I've spent years trying to figure my own stuff out on this topic and trying to be more aware and progressive in the way I see these things. And, you know, I'm not that way, that it wasn't, you know, so this is all the conversation I'm having in my head. It took some really great coaching from my business partner who also happens to be my life partner. And she and I had a discussion about this. And she asked, just asked me a very simple question, and this is the crux of it. It's what can leaders do to kind of get out of this? She asked me the question, just simply, why do you think this young African American woman reacted the way she did? And she just, took me out of my head and my own justification and excuses, and quite honestly, some level of fear about where this might go, and had me really think about the other person, the other individual, her experiences. And once I went there, it was obvious. I mean, I've studied this stuff. I know exactly what's going on. It's the attribution that one black person represents all black people, and they're going to think a certain way in a homogeneous way, et cetera. And so I got on my email, wrote an email to this woman, apologized for what I did, explained my belief of understanding why she said what she did, and requested that we have a call together. So you might be thinking in terms of the story, well, that's the end of it, kind of the end of my learning. But the learning continued. There was no response from her, no, setting up of a call or anything, never heard from her. And so it kicked back in for me. What's going on here? I don't deserve this, et cetera, et cetera. And then had to go back into the same mode of why might this reasonable, rational, intelligent person not want to have a phone call with me? And again, the answer came clear. She has lived her whole life trying to make white people not feel bad about what they just did, and having to explain to people like me about the situation. And as I was thinking about telling this story, I said, well, should I really do this? We got a bunch of people. There's a very good chance this woman is in the audience today. And I guess what I would say is thank you. Thank you for not having that call. Because instead of the forgive and forget conversation, I'll never forget it.
Thank you, Frank. That's a really powerful story that shows the full, journey of committing the bias and the microaggression, moving into a place of awareness, not just once, but twice, and then really getting to that final moment of a fuller scope of understanding that this is kind of my work to do. I can't rely on this other person. And that goes back to that covering and the otherness aspects that carry such a huge physical and cognitive burden for people of color to have to manage that for everyone else when they're just trying to exist, essentially. Demetrius, I don't want to leave you out of this moment. Can you give us a 30-second rundown of when those conversations maybe don't go as beautifully as Frank's side of his experience, and maybe we're still sitting in our feelings as a leader, not wanting to really connect our bias? How can we overcome that?
Well, I just wanted to, again, acknowledge Frank's story. I've heard that more than once, and every time I'm touched, moved, and inspired by it. And part of it, overcoming it, is what Frank talked about, is having the humility to admit a mistake and reaching out to attempt to correct it. And even though the person may not be receptive to it, at least he knows in his heart that he's done the right thing by making the gesture to do so. So I applaud you for that, Frank. What I'd like to drill down on is just the awareness piece of the intent versus impact. These are conversations, we all have many of them each and every day, right? And so I run into this pitfall of making the mistake of thinking that I'm intending one thing and then it landing in another way. And so what I'm mindful of is studying body language. I'm mindful of, has the conversation in some way been disrupted? is there a physical feeling that I can see that I'm causing by saying what I'm saying to this person? And as a person who has, 5 children, 3 boys, 2 girls, from 26 down to 11, I often get the intent versus impact completely wrong as a father every day. So I have a great feedback loop with my children, not to mention, colleagues. It's just having this awareness that what you may be saying may not be landing in the way that you think you're landing. So I think it's important that you validate that it's landing in the right way so that you can continue to move on. And when you sense that it isn't, then seek to understand. What is it that I have said that has made you feel this way? Well, again, I self-identify as male, and you thought I was a female. That triggered me, and I had an emotional response to it, and I was going to shut down. And where it shows up in our workplaces are all the things that you mentioned earlier, James: disengagement, lack of innovation, and so forth, are consequences for that, whether it's in our families and or in our workplaces. So again, now that you're aware of this, as James pointed out with Maya Angelou, whom I happen to love, I named my oldest daughter after Maya Angelou, and that is, be aware, be curious, and caring, and some of the comments I've made. I don't want to get ahead of the skis here, because I know you're going to talk about that, but be aware, we all have this in everyday conversations. Our intent, in a lot of cases, doesn't land the way that we need it to land.
Nice way to close that, Demetrius. Thank you. And, I think that from the examples that we just shared, we can clearly see that intent, impact, and trust really have a connected relationship. We want people to feel safe around us and safe in who they are and being able to show up as their full selves. So let's talk now about how we can move to that proactive place. We've found awareness, we want to do something about it, and we want to start being more inclusive as we work to continuously address that personal bias and build trust in the right way. And so we look at this first tool. Bias can manifest itself in our preference towards certain people over others, as well as those that are different from us, clearly. This is reflected in who we spend time with, what we learn about them, how often we speak to them, and the quality of those interactions, who we build trust with, and ultimately who we champion as leaders. Research demonstrates that people who feel othered in the workplace also experience less feedback, fewer opportunities for growth and development, and as a result, fewer opportunities for promotion and advancement. And again, identifying our biases can be really hard work, but identifying bias is not enough. We also have to move to address it both proactively and reactively. And so we have 2 tools that can help us with that work. The first one is what we see here, the Know, Say, Do tool. And it's designed to help raise our awareness about who we might have an unconscious bias toward, and to help us take the first step toward countering that bias. Know, Say, Do helps us focus on what we know about others, what we say about them and to them, and what we do for and with them as partners working towards the same goals. And whether or not we use the examples we see here within each section on how to follow Know, Say, Do, our goal is to become more conscious of how we can use this approach with everyone at work, and not just those we lead. And so, think about all the trust we can create with this tool if we use it frequently and with conscious effort, especially in how we build connections with people who aren't like us. So kind of stretching our comfort zone there. And also, we can follow the CARE model. This alludes to a little bit of what Demetrius and some of the other panelists pointed out in our last discussion. We follow the CARE model as we think about having inclusive conversations. We are curious and we stay interested in the other person while we work to suspend judgment. We remain authentic and try to show up as our best self every time. We take responsibility for our impact, regardless of the intent. So rather than "I didn't mean to," saying "I'm sorry" and moving from there. And then throughout, we expand our understanding by just remaining humble and open to hearing them out and seeing what's next in our learning journey. An inclusive conversation or communication is different from how we typically communicate because it usually requires a shift in how we approach it. And these conversations are built on certain ways of being that can help build connection and a sense of belonging. Regardless of the subject, at the end of the communication, the other person should know better where you stand or what matters to you in the communication. They should also feel really valued and heard, and they should feel whole and complete, meaning nothing's left unsaid, nothing's left on the table to discuss, or at least we're on the path to get there. And this approach also helps us achieve that both proactive and reactively. Like the unconscious inclusion model, care is also not linear, but a way of interaction. And so our work starts with awareness always, and then once we understand bias and know that we carry it, we can then start to do something about it using these two models or tools. These tools really give us a way to turn awareness into action. So segueing into our last quick conversation, with so many tools available to leaders to increase inclusion, we still often see a lot of struggle moving from knowing to doing. So Frank, I'm going to go to you. Even though we are equipping leaders with tools that are valuable, and they're everywhere, especially now, you access social media, there's so much there that we're inundated with, we still sometimes see leaders or people in general not really put them to use. What do you think is holding leaders back?
All right, thanks, James. And I'm conscious of the amount of time I spent on the last one, so I'll be quick here. My one-word answer to this question is fear. It's from a leader's perspective, from my own perspective as a leader, fear of getting it wrong, fear of getting it right, and what's going to happen. What is the consequence? How does this? Where do these kind of conversations go? I heard recently a young African American man, 18-year-old guy, delivering at a Black Lives Matter rally, and he spoke directly to this. And I'm just going to quote him and then hand off to my colleagues. He said, as he was starting to address the large group that was gathered there, he said, "I have to admit I'm nervous. I might say the wrong thing to you, the wrong things to my Black friends, the wrong things to my white friends, the wrong things to the media. But I realized the only wrong thing would be to say nothing. So here I am." I'll hand it over to my colleagues.
A powerful quote for sure. Stace, kind of final thoughts for this last discussion before we move to our Q&A. What's holding leaders back?
I totally agree, fear. And to the second question there, how can we further better support them? Leading the way, Frank, sharing examples like that, being willing to admit to our own fear. You mentioned, Demetrius, psychological safety. So learning more about what comprises that, and then as leaders working to create a climate, the key that Google found in their study about psychological safety on teams was that people were willing to speak up because they trusted their colleagues not to ridicule them. And so we can make safe spaces and encourage others to do that. And that's all I got.
Thanks, Stace. Demetrius?
Yeah, I'll just put a quick beat on it just to build on, Frank's story. And thank you, Stace, for bringing in psychological safety again, which I'm a big fan of and I think works, seen it work. Again, fear, I would echo that. And one of the things I learned early on about fear was that, if you look at it as an acronym, I think of it, every time I hear that word, I think about one, F is for false, E is for expectations, A is for appearing, and the R is for real. And so I question my own judgment as to why am I being fearful of this conversation or the situation that I am. And I examine that, and then how do I get out of that? I try to seek to understand and be relatable, and if I can, empathize with the situation, and show compassion and in some cases sympathy, because empathy, quite frankly, I'm hearing a lot discussed in corporations, may not be possible in every case, because It's impossible for me to know what it's like to be Stace on a day-to-day basis, or Frank on a day-to-day basis, or James for that matter. And it's also true in the vice versa, right? But what we can have is compassion for each other, and then I may get some pushback on this word, demonstrate some sympathy and care around the other person's lived experience. It doesn't necessarily have to be one that we've experienced, but to be able to relate to what their pain may be. So I'll jump out of the double dutch and hand it back over to you, James.
Thank you, Demetrius. And again, I think all of that still leans on the aspect of staying curious, right? Everything that we've said here and staying open to that curiosity and the work that comes with it. And this is hard work. I think that's very clear. People have to be vulnerable and willing to move to that vulnerable place. And Frank, your example shows that clearly. So thank you to each of you for sharing those really great examples. And in looking at our tools are only effective if we use them, and not just once, but repeatedly. I'll leave us with a quote from Henry Ford. He once said, "Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is success." So we all really hope to get to that place of togetherness by confronting our personal bias and working towards inclusion. So let's open up our Q&A. Kayla, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, yes. Well, thank you, everyone, for the lively engagement in the chat panel. It's fantastic to read your thoughts. And thank you, most importantly, to our panelists for joining us today. I know I personally really appreciated this conversation. So I want to remind everyone, if you have a question for our panelists, go ahead and add it either to the chat panel or the Q&A at this time. There are a lot of questions that came in, and we won't be able to get to all of them here in the next 8 minutes or so. But I want to make sure that we are able to follow up with you after today's discussion. I'll also make sure that their contact information is available along with a PDF of the slide deck and a copy of the recording that we did today. So go ahead and dive into some of these questions. Okay, so the first question I'm going to go with is, do you guys have any advice on how frontline leaders can model inclusion and cultural humility and promote behaviors that engender the trust required for strong teamwork? So let's see, do one of you guys want to jump in? You just feel free to unmute yourself.
I'll just dive in with something quick, and then we can, I'll hand it back over, again, double dutching here. Values. You start with values. Examine your own. What are your top 5? What are your company's values? And find a way to connect to those company values, model and embrace them. And it's been said earlier by both Frank and Stace that leading by example is crucial, especially for leaders, because people are looking up to you and everything that you do is being examined and judged. After all, all of us are meaning-making machines, and we see people in leadership positions. As Stace mentioned earlier, we expect more from them. Again, we're all come to this thinking we're good people, and we expect more of our leaders. So my suggestion is examine your values, identify the company values, connect to them in a way that creates shared meaning for you and your team, and model it. Now I'm going to jump out of the double dutch.
Thank you, Demetrius. Stace or Frank, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, connecting on values is powerful, and also thinking about what is the universal human need that this other person has. You'll know it's a real need if you recognize that that's valid for everybody. A need to be seen, a need to be respected. That's the power of values-based leadership. And I'll stop there because we got a bunch more questions, and I know Frank and Demetrius also have more wisdom to share.
We do have several questions. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and jump into this next one, and I think this is really important given the landscape that we're in with our virtual workforce. But what are some options that you can share for virtual training during remote work, and how can these conversations be scaled online?
I'll just say quickly, be intentional. Be willing to admit that you're being intentional. Show the math, as we sometimes say, and be willing to be a little bit more overt about checking in with people. And don't hesitate, as Frank and Demetrius have modeled so beautifully today, to use your own allowable weaknesses and relevant vulnerability. You don't want to lead with that. I'm not suggesting that you be that way all the time, but occasionally it is just super powerful. So set the tone and be a little bit more explicit in the online space about the importance of these issues to you, why they matter, why you personally care, your personal motivation, and be really receptive when people reach out.
May I add, Frank, I'm just before I lose this thought, and I'll be quick. I really like the CARE model here because if you're going to have an open dialogue about a sensitive topic, and again, race seems to be the one that we're engaged in mostly with organizations, I think the CARE model is powerful in preparing the organization to have this discussion, let's say in the form at scale through a town hall. But prior to that, set the ground rules for the town hall and give people a tool to engage. If you're going to do breakout rooms in a town hall, depending on the topic you'll be discussing, let's say it's allyship, you got to prepare the organization in advance of what they're walking into. If you're going to really have a meaningful discussion about the topic. And allow people to grow and make mistakes within that space, again, using psychological safety. Jumping out.
The only thing I would add, and let me say, I am or have not been a huge fan of this media. Maybe it's my maybe it's my age, maybe it's what I've grown up with, or my personality, or whatever. But I really think people have gotten really comfortable and familiar with communicating in this way. Think of all the family get-togethers that are happening through this type of media. Very meaningful conversations, unfortunately, even, sickness and end-of-life kind of conversations that are going on in this kind of media. And I'm almost thinking maybe we shouldn't be so fearful of having these kind of conversations in this media. I think people are ready for it.
Great. Well, then following on, as Demetrius has mentioned, the CARE model, I'll take one more question. I've got 2 minutes, so if you guys can give me your fastest answers. What, in your experience, does the culture or climate of an organization have to look like in order to encourage and support the use of the CARE model? I think that's a really important question. Do any of you want to take that one?
Yeah, I guess I can start it with not a particularly simple answer. If the culture is there to support it, then it's easy. If it's not, then it becomes kind of a play within a play. It's much like just making change happen out in society in general. The culture has to be addressed at the same point as the specific conversations have to be addressed. And I think it takes courageous advocacy and people who are willing to step up and speak up and stand out and really looking for, if the culture is not supportive in this way, really looking for some leaders within the culture who might be and who are willing to step up and stand out and make that change happen. I don't have a simpler answer than that.
I go, Demetrius. Sorry.
Oh no, please. I defer to you. I'll follow you.
I was just going to say, Frank, to your point, recognizing that it's bigger than any one of us. strive to be the change. Think about creating the culture in every interaction you have with people, even if they're not coming from that same place. And certainly with those you're privileged to work closely with and to lead, create that pocket of culture. People will see it. Change comes slowly. But as I think it was Martin Luther King said, you know, the arc of history is long, but it always moves in that direction one way or another toward justice. So be part of that, even on a small scale. And don't lose heart. You know, practice good self-care. You're going to need it along the way.
But thank you for that, Stace. Anytime someone quotes Martin Luther King Jr., I get goosebumps simply because I'm a Morehouse man, and we learned everything about Martin Luther King Jr. and then some as a student. So thank you for invoking my fellow Morehouse man. This is a darn good question. I'd love to meet the person who asked it, because the way it landed for me has to do with courage and intentionality. Because if you're going to have an inclusive culture, in a lot of cases, you know, we get hired to work with companies to help diversify the organizations. And if I had a nickel for every time someone said, my gosh, if we could only find, you know, the talent, and the talent is here. As someone once said, talent is universal, but access isn't. I think people attach that quote to Clinton, but I don't think he came up with it. But that's something that you look around your organization and say, who do we want to be and who are we becoming? And I'm obviously, the work that we get to do is to help organizations, you know, develop partnerships with others that can help them diversify the organization. And you have to be intentional about that. And what I also hear is, well, are we lowering the bar by bringing in all, you know, these, you know, quote unquote, you know, these other people? And it's not lowering the bar, it's diversifying the organization, because all you got to do is look at any of the research from McKinsey, Catalyst, GP Strategies that shows that diversifying your organization, and I'm sorry I mentioned McKinsey first. I meant to mention GP Strategies first, then McKinsey last, is that the research is conclusive, right? And so let's go out and do it. And as CEO of TIAA Craft, Roger Ferguson says, if you haven't seen the video, Google it, find it. It's a really good one. He says, look, let's get on with this, you know, at the board level and diversify at all levels. And let's just do it, because in the industries that we're working across, whether it's finance, healthcare, or tech, you know, the numbers are woefully low in terms of, you know, diversity. So courage and intentionality, and get on with it.
Oh, Demetrius, thank you. I so appreciate that. And yes, I think we'll all be leaving this call today and ready to get on with it. So thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you, James, for facilitating. Thank you to all of our participants today for your time and attention. We hope you'll join us again for our future webinars. This is actually the first in our series on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we hope that you'll join us for our next. They will be every other week for the next 2 months or so. And we hope that you can join us for those as well. Registration is available on our webinar page at gpstrategies.com. I wish everyone a wonderful and productive rest of your week.
Thank you. Thank you.
This webinar is brought to you by GP Strategies. Together we can create a world where business excellence makes possibilities achievable. You can access more webinars or download additional resources at gpstrategies.com/resources-library.